Hello, hello. This is Nancy Schick. I am here on this lovely third Thursday of the month, as I am every month. And we're going to talk today about protected classes and conflict at work. This has become an ongoing issue that I think a lot of employers are lacking the skills to navigate that. And we're going to go into some of the reasons behind that and talk about some of the case studies that I've come across recently. Obviously, I won't be using actual names, I will be protecting the identity of the people that I've been working with. But I thought this was a very timely topic, especially in light of the fact that we've had DEI bans at the federal level, and there's been a lot of confusion about what that means for private companies, higher education, K through 12 even. So we're going to go through some of the tips on that. It's not going to necessarily directly relate to each one of those. Obviously, I also will be giving you my usual disclaimer. So we'll get into all of this on this particular live stream. So feel free to put any comments that you have in the chat. I am keeping an eye out for that. And I'll try to answer your questions as we go through everything. And I apologize, I'm having a little wonkiness with my slides today. There we go. So today's focus is going to be on understanding some of the conflict dynamics. We'll talk about some of the protected classes that we are seeing come in conflict and how to navigate that. The number one rule, you're going to hear me say it a few times today, is there is no hierarchy of protected classes. There are some questions, and there is that Ames case that I'll be probably talking about later in the summer once the Supreme Court comes down with their decision. But we'll talk about how the non-protected classes, basically the majority classes, how that Ames case is going to affect, for example, white men in the workplace. I think it's just I gotta talk about the elephant in the room. So that's really what the Ames case is about: is how do white cisgender people function in the workplace? Do you have a right to discriminate against them? And what does that even mean? So I'm going to try to answer some of those questions today. Again, we're waiting for the Supreme Court of the United States to come down with that Ames decision. So I'm not going to be touching on that today. Stay tuned. I will, once that decision comes down, cover that particular issue. I'm also going to today, then we're going to talk about the conflict dynamics. We're going to talk about the impact of the DEI ban and why it's so important for you to start building your skills at navigating these kinds of conflicts. They're probably, depending on the size of your business, they're probably already occurring. Some of you who are employees, you may already know that, right? You might be experiencing it, and I invite you to reach out if you need some help learning how to raise the issue with your employer, learning how to navigate the conflicts you might have with certain coworkers or even supervisors, right? That is definitely something that I see all the time, and it's nuanced, and it might not always be unlawful discrimination, but it's still something that you have to learn to work through. So we'll talk about some of the tips to do that today. And then I'm going to talk about severance agreements a little bit because you may have seen the video that I did promoting this particular webinar. And I talked about a person that we'll call Hannah and how she initially came to me with a severance agreement. And the more I talked to her, it became clear that she was told she was being terminated because she had discriminated, and what the employer missed is that she had also been discriminated against, and they had not properly addressed that. So this is, again, happening in workplaces all across the country, and I want you to not be one of them. So here we are talking about Hannah's story. So again, she came to me after she got an unexpected termination notice. And she knew that there had been an investigation of some complaints about her and how she functioned in the workplace. People didn't really like her style. They thought that she was harsh. They expected her to act a certain way. And it may have been that they expected that because she was a woman. There were comments about her age, her gender identity, etcetera, that had completely been overlooked. So, she sensed when she first came to me that maybe she wasn't getting all the severance that she deserved, but as you can imagine, anybody that's been terminated from their employment, you can imagine that it's a very emotional experience. It's, usually is a little bit of a surprise. Maybe not that you don't see some sort of discipline coming, but most people who have been terminated from employment are taken by surprise at least a little bit because you never really know, even if it's coming, you don't know what day it's coming, et cetera. What's the severity of the discipline, et cetera. And that was pretty much her story. And she sensed that something just was not fair about the severance agreement that she was given. Now, mind you, severance agreements are not mandatory in New York. Employers do not have to pay you anything if they terminate your employment. But when they do this, they're usually going to ask for a waiver of claims, which is why in this particular case, that we looked at the hostile work environment, which may give her leverage, or any employee that's been given a severance agreement. You're going to be asked for a waiver of claims, such as claims for hostile work environment harassment, right? So in her case, it was harassment based on her gender identity, her age, her race, her religion. And it all started, she was Jewish, and it started around October 7th, 2023, which, for again, for those of you who are paying attention to that, that's the date that the war in Gaza heated up again and went into a full-blown conflict. So, I'm sure you've seen the news stories. This shouldn't surprise anyone that a lot of employers had employees that were taking a stand on the war in Gaza, and we're still seeing that on college campuses. We're seeing it with deportations, and all of this is in the news on a pretty regular basis. But back in October of 2023, when this was first happening, some employers actually had petitions floating around their workplaces. They may have had either protesters nearby on the college campuses that sometimes then, if they knew that a business had Jewish employees, may have also put flyers up or spray painted or otherwise vandalized certain properties. That continues to happen, right? We've had an increase in anti-Semitic behavior, and in Hannah's case, we said we don't feel like her employer addressed her concerns about that, and they were highly focused on the concerns of some of the other employees who identified differently. So that was where the protected classes came into conflict. A lot of this came down to some people of color strongly identify with the Palestinians in Gaza, for example. And again, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, but they identify as an oppressed group. They identify with other oppressed groups. And so the goal of most of the protesters is to raise awareness for fairness, right? We're calling for an end of the violence against any of the innocent people in the Gaza area. And that's where these protected classes were coming into conflict. And this is, again, probably happening in workplaces all over the country. I've seen multiple cases of this since 2023. And that was why I decided to teach the course that I did for Law Line. So if any attorneys are out there that are watching this, I invite you to go and watch my course on There Is No Hierarchy of Protected Classes, because I address that very issue. And again, we'll find out more of how this stretches beyond protected classes once the Supreme Court decides the Ames case. Now, ultimately, by the way, you may be wondering what happened to Hannah. So she really loved her job and she didn't want to cause a big stink. She obviously was losing her job. She loved working in the profession that she was in and is still working in that profession. So one of the things that we did is we negotiated a better severance for her with a little bit of extra money, but a lot more extra support for her to find her next employer. And that came in part out of the employer, I think, recognizing that this was an unfortunate situation, that it was easiest to remove one person than multiple people, and this was awful for everyone. I personally think that had we gotten involved earlier, we might have been able to navigate some sort of better resolution for everyone, but that was ultimately what happened. It's Hannah ended up getting a little bit more severance and has moved on to her next job, and from what I hear, she's doing fairly well. We'll come back to why her employer might not still be doing well. So the legal landscape of all of this is that we're dealing with not just the DEI bans at the federal level and employers trying to figure out what to do about that, but it is looking at the policy shifts then, right? Internally, you're looking at that. It's looking at the non-discrimination laws, which have not changed, right? Title VII, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, those all remain in full effect. So employers, if depending on what your state law is in the various states where you're operating, you probably still have the same obligation. So that's something you have to be very, very aware of, and that's why I'm doing this particular live stream is this is a concern. You may be rolling back your forward-facing DEI policies, taking them off of your website. You might not be implementing at the same level that you did before. Some would argue that a lot of what was being done was performative anyway, and so I'm somewhat happy to see employers pulling back and reassessing, ideally with legal counsel, the DEI initiatives that they had in place to make sure that they weren't going too far and that they're still complying with Title VII, the ADA, ADEA, human rights laws, depending on what your state has, and sometimes you have local laws like we do in New York City. You wanna make sure that you're still meeting all those obligations because even though the federal government may be threatening you with, for example, a criminal investigation if you continue to have DEI programs, you still need to have compliance programs, which means you still need to be training and assessing what your internal practices are. And I'll be doing a series of webinars with Spectra Diversity on some of those topics as well. Spectra, if you're not familiar with them, it's spectradiversity.com. You'll see that they do the internal assessments to help you identify where you have inequitable policies. And that's based on both what your employers or employees are saying and what your executive team is seeing, right? So it's a top down, bottom up approach to meet in the middle. You can imagine a mediator. I really like that kind of thing. And that's because you're still going to have to work together and you need to do it in a fair way that is non-discriminating. And then I want to talk about the risk there, right? So I'm again still getting these types of cases. Doesn't mean I dislike having work. I just dislike seeing people hurt. And I hate seeing businesses get sued, for example, for things that were easily preventable. So you want to be paying closer attention. And if you find yourself leaning toward, for example, one particular class of people over another when you're hearing complaints, that's human, right? Doesn't make you a terrible person, but it is likely to lead you down the road to a potential claim, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So when you feel that, it's you have to notice that as a leader, you have to be paying attention. And if you find yourself, for example, we say believe women, right, during the Me Too movement. But if you are were charged with investigating a complaint by a woman, automatically believing her without conducting a fair and impartial investigation could lead you into a legal risk. And I know that's an unpopular position, but I'm just sharing the law with you, not necessarily telling you that this is what I believe, but I do have a duty to uphold the laws of this country and this state, the state of New York. So I am telling you that this could get you in hot water, and that's what I don't want you to have for a variety of reasons. One, it's expensive for you as an employer. That's in time, money, and energy. You also, it affects your risk rating. You probably know that for your insurance, but you lose great employees in those situations as well, and it does tend to change your culture, right? It will invite more disgruntled employees. It may invite more claims. It's just so much better to be proactive on this. You'll be hearing more about that. I talk about it regularly, but I am writing my second book, and we'll be talking about that particular issue in future webinars. So here's the reality of protected classes that are coming in conflict. So I gave you one of the ones I've been seeing a lot, but I've seen it in other situations as well. So it's not just the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in Gaza that has people coming into conflict. You probably know this. We do have political classes coming together, right? Or political people that identify with certain political parties or conservative versus liberal views coming into conflict. That's not quite the same thing, but we are seeing it, right? You don't have necessarily protected classes there. But what I need you as leaders listening for are the issues beneath those the surface of political party identity or other identities that your employees may have. So, for example, you may have someone who is not openly gay who is expressing certain strong opinions about transgender athletes, um, bathrooms, and other issues that tend to align with what we would consider more liberal views. They may be coming into conflict with someone who has a particular religious affiliation that has strong beliefs against homosexuality. These are not things that you should be making decisions on of who's right and who's wrong, right? If you remember, we tend to have the standard of sincerely held religious belief, and you've probably heard that in several cases where, for example, the very Christian bakers did not wanna bake the cake for the homosexual or I think they may have been lesbian, a lesbian couple, right? Either way, it was a same-sex marriage, and the bakers did not wanna do that, and they argued that they had the religious exception and that they did have a sincerely held religious belief. So you may find yourself needing to navigate those types of issues, and I would recommend that you not do that on your own. Those are the kinds of things that you wanna be listening for and say, "Maybe I should consult legal counsel with this because I feel underskilled." Again, the moment that you think you know the answer on these very gray issues is the moment that you're going to get yourself into trouble. So that's what I want you hearing, if nothing else. You want to be looking for more guidance when you have those protected classes in conflict. And again, there is no hierarchy of protected classes. You have a duty as an employer to make sure you're treating people fairly, which means you treat them the same. And I understand that that may raise some issues and questions about equity, and I invite you to ask those questions. You can ask them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. So other things, it's the differing perspectives, right? It's between groups. Something else I want you listening for is this age discrimination. We have an increase of in cases of age discrimination all the time. It may seem funny that, "Okay, boomer," right? We've been saying that now for years. That's not appropriate in the workplace. Likewise, if you're judging people too young to do something, etcetera, you can find yourself potentially, we'll see how Ames comes down, but you could find yourself in a discrimination complaint there. Either way, you have an unfair judgment of someone based on their age, when really what we always want to go back to is the person properly skilled, educated, experienced to do their job? And I've been predicting this for a while, that we would start using more broadly the ADA standard, and I think you're hearing some talk about that. It's not a formal standard, but it's a good guideline, which is, are you focusing on the essential functions of the job and whether or not the employee can do it? So when people come into conflict in your workplace, that is exactly where you want to start thinking, is, are you focusing on getting the job done? Not whether you like someone, not whether you identify with them, whether they went to the same school you went to, they identify the same way you do, they dress the same way you, whatever, that you both like to play golf together or pickleball or whatever it might be. That has nothing to do with whether or not they can do the job. And what happens is, when you start making those decisions and you start aligning too closely with someone based on things that aren't related to the job directly, that's where you'll start to see the societal tensions come up, the toxic environment, and you basically set a culture that says it's okay to have favorites and preferences that have nothing to do with the ability to do the job. So, again, I'm inviting you to look deeply at how you relate to your employees and see what you can do to root out those hidden biases that get you into trouble. And then once you start doing that, what do you do with it, right? You've started to identify that, oh, maybe I have been favoring my female employees over my male employees, or vice versa, or any other group. That is where you have to look at how to build the skills to not favor. Now, it can be different. Again, you may have, as some people do, you might have a highly, religious business, for example, and there may be a religious exception, but you would need to make sure that you're getting the guidance of legal counsel for that, to make sure that you have a true exception, and there are definitely limitations on that. So, the ideally, what you're always looking for is, are you creating a productive environment that furthers the business? It's not your personal goals necessarily, and as an employer myself, I have to always be recognizing that although I am the face of my business, I am the person who founded this business, and it's founded based on a lot of my personally held beliefs, but that doesn't mean I have a right to hold them over and use them as a sword to get rid of people. I also recognize, because I've worked in the DEI space for many years, that the diversity that I have in my workplace, and that's not just employees, because I'm a much smaller business than I was maybe 10 years ago. But when I do have employees, it might be contractors, it could be my vendors, my collaborators. It's recognizing that I'm always looking at skill. Can they get done what I need them to do, even though I may really like them? And those of you who've hired your friends, for example, you probably know what I'm talking about here, is that if you hire based on your appreciation for someone, how much you like them, how much you want to help them. I have written about this as well, that those are not good reasons to hire. those are good reasons to maybe loan somebody some money, give them a gift, help them in other ways, but probably not a good idea to bring them into your business that way. Ultimately, there are certain things that need to be done to have a productive environment, and one of them is to make sure you're treating people fairly and consistently, applying the rules the same to everyone, right? That's basic fairness. And so building that conflict resolution skill then when you recognize that you've either got conflicts among your employees or maybe you personally have a conflict with an employee, it's going to be critical, I think, especially in the current climate around our courts, the backlogs that we have, and just the way that courts are set up. They will typically destroy a relationship, whereas if you intervene early, before it gets to a long, drawn out lawsuit, a lot of times you can resolve this, you can save the relationship, you can transform the relationship, and you find that your once good employee who maybe you now have a conflict with hasn't been performing as well, turns back into the employee you hired. And so a lot of times in mediation, that's what we'll do is we'll go back to, remember when you came together to work together? Let's go back there. What went wrong? And then we start dismantling that and rebuilding. It's going to be an ongoing, persistent need, right? This is the other part of it is that's why you want to start building skills in this now. It's going to be better for you, I think, in the long run. I wouldn't be out there promoting what I do if I didn't think I could actually help you and people like me who can keep you out of court. The laws aren't going away. Again, the DEI bans are applying to the federal government and federal government contractors. They're saying, "We don't wanna see those programs," but that doesn't mean the law does not still exist. So you have to focus on developing those culturally sensitive strategies, having clear reporting mechanisms, and understanding unconscious bias, which means you have to go looking for your own. I'm always looking for mine as well, and it's disturbing sometimes the thoughts that I have that I don't even know where they came from. It does again, doesn't mean you're a bad person. We know enough now about brain science to know that your brain will just automatically be looking for threats. So things that look new and different will often trigger your amygdala that makes you then look for what might be threatening about somebody who doesn't look like you or seem like you. So it's again, it's not that you're a terrible person, it just means you're human, and because you're human, you have to watch for some of those human fallibilities. So here's just a little bit about what we're seeing on various forms of harassment in the workplace. I thought you might be interested in seeing that we're still seeing a large number of racial conflicts, sex conflicts, and that would include LGBTQ, right? All of the transgender issues fall into that as well. So just be aware of that. If you remember the Bostock case from several years ago, if you're making a decision based on sex, such as a dress code for men versus women, then you are probably discriminating, and that would be unlawful discrimination. So you need to be thinking about all of your policies and where they come from. We are still seeing a lot of disability discrimination, and that's coming into play because of a variety of things, not just what you consider a disability that's a visible disability, right? Or a permanent disability like hearing impairment or visual impairment, things that, we're used to thinking about as disability, but there are temporary disabilities that may come into play as well with an illness that ideally someone recovers from. And so you may have to navigate that, and there's a whole process for that. That's why I said, we need to always go back to the essential functions of the job and look at, is there a way for this employee to still do the job? Do they have all the skills? Can they do that? And do they need an accommodation? And that's where that standard comes from. Because ultimately, we want people who are ready, willing, and able to work to be able to work. And that includes no matter how old they are and Yes, they may have a religion that's different and requires them to maybe be home before sundown or take certain days off. But depending on your workplace, you might be able to work around that. So we want to be looking at all of those things. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed and think, gosh, this is a lot, that's why you don't do it without legal counsel. So here are some proactive strategies for employers, for individuals, and for those of you that are licensed professionals. I didn't really mention that as much, but I wanted to highlight that as because I do work with a lot of licensed professionals, and that would be attorneys, social workers, funeral directors, and in particular, these professionals, those of you who are licensed professionals, you know this, you have ethical standards as well. So we're not just talking about complying with the law, we're also talking about your ethical obligations and how a discrimination complaint could actually attach to your license. It could have to do with whether or not you get suspended and you can continue to practice your profession. Usually, I don't see a complete disbarment, for example, with a lawyer, but you might see some sort of discipline if you have an egregious case. So for employers, it's focusing on that skill-based training. When you have protected classes in conflict, you wanna make sure that you're allowing open dialogue, but have it guided with someone who is skilled in hearing the microaggressions and addressing them, making sure that we're having a discussion of mutual respect, right? Grounded in mutual respect and focused on this is an opportunity for us to look for solutions, ways to come together. I talk a lot about forgiveness in these situations. I help people do what I call a complete apology, not just the, "Ah, I'm sorry, okay," right? But apologizing specifically for what was done, telling what you're going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again. And then allowing the time to do that consistently so you rebuild trust. That's what a complete apology requires. And that's why you see a lot of people will apologize publicly and then nothing changes. So you have to be aware that you got to be your word. Your employees are going to demand that, and they have other options. And we're seeing that more and more that employees are opting out. So if you want top talent, these are the things that we recommend that you do to be proactive and avoid these claims. And then you want to make sure, as I've tried to stress throughout this particular webinar, is you want to make sure you're reviewing those workplace policies regularly. If there's, for example, a DEI program, now is the time that you need to be looking. I'll talk more about that, and I've written about this. I'll be doing that web series with Spectra Diversity about some of this as well. But the federal government has only said illegal DEI programs, but has not really defined what that means. So, what that leaves you to do is interpret. Since most of you probably are not lawyers, I would recommend that you contact your employment lawyer to make sure that you're aligning your workplace policies, including if you're, as some of my clients are, doubling down on DEI. We will talk to you about how to do that and avoid the criminal investigation from the Department of Justice to the best of our ability, and also still meet your goals with that. So there are ways to navigate this and stay within the legal DEI, and I'll get into that in more detail in the future. For those of you that are individuals, your employees, you might even be in a management role, but you're still an employee of the company that you're working for. Then some of the things that you can do if you do lose your job, have a review of your severance agreement. Make sure that you're looking for the potential discrimination. As I've talked to employees about, as I talked to Hannah about, who opened this whole conversation, that's where your leverage is. If there has been some discrimination, it's not just about you walking away because you just wanna move on with your life, and you're completely entitled to do that. Of course, I would want you to do what's best for you, and I work with clients all the time on figuring that out. But if there is ongoing discrimination, alerting people to that not only could get you a little bit more severance, but it also may mean that you help change culture. And that's a personal decision that I'm happy to walk you through on a one-to-one call. The other thing, if you have not lost your job, and we're not talking about severance, but you are a bystander in a discrimination situation, addressing that promptly is very, very important. Again, not just for your own well-being and the well-being of your coworkers, the culture of where you work, but it also empowers you in a variety of ways. And you may be saying, "Well, I'm afraid to say something because they might retaliate against me." And there are laws against retaliation. So that would be another one of those situations that if you're not sure how to address it, then I'm happy to help you form language to do that. But the bottom line there is I don't want you working in toxic workplaces and tolerating it. There are so many other ways that you can make your living, and I know that seems very idealistic, and it might not be the same amount of money, but these are some personal choices that sometimes I help clients make so that you're most empowered and legally protected. So, what questions do you have? I see some people dropped off. I know it's a difficult time of the day, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can just put them in the chat. And if not, thank you so much for coming. I hope I've answered some questions, but also have you thinking about some of the things that you should be listening for in your workplace, because these are very subtle types of complaints. And a lot of employers, again, are not thinking about the various rights of all the protected classes. And I can see it on a regular basis, unfortunately, where even employers who mean well have gotten themselves in hot water because, for example, they aligned very strongly with Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and again, started then prioritizing women over men, which is going to lead them down that road of probably treating people unfairly based on sex. So again, the Ames case is gonna answer a little bit of that and give us some more guidance, we hope, but ultimately, even if it's not unlawful discrimination, you can probably hear that treating people differently based on their sex is going to alienate employees and possibly have you lose good employees even if it doesn't get you sued, so that's something else to think about. And then likewise, if you're prioritizing, for example, Black employees for the best intent to try and correct past wrongs, that's where equity has unfortunately gotten a little off track because you as an employer don't have the ability to change the past. As an individual, none of us do. But what we can do as employers is we can correct the inequities in our workplaces. We can address what we do have power over, right? We can do it there, and that's what I work with a lot of employers on, is how do you do that to try and create opportunities for people who have been historically marginalized and give them a path, but in a way that also protects the rights of everyone, and it's a constant balancing game that is just not easy to do on your own, and that's why I do these. So thank you again. I don't see any questions, so I am going to call it a day for this particular webinar. Feel free to reach out if you need it.